Bienvenidos a todos. My name is Robert Hoban. I'm an attorney in the United States. My law firm, the Hoban Law Group, was the first national cannabis-only law firm for the last 12 years. And because of that, I've done a lot of work in cannabis investing over the years. I've worked as a securities and an M&A attorney in this space for nearly 13 years now. On July 1st of this year, I sold my law firm, the Hoban Law Group. I sold it to a large firm, a top 100 firm called Clark Hill. Clark Hill has 700 lawyers, and it has offices across the United States and outside of the United States. Its hubs are Mexico City and Dublin, Ireland in the European Union. In addition, I founded a company called Gateway Proven Strategies, GPS. The website is gps.global. GPS was formed 3 years ago, and it has consistently acquired small consulting companies from around the world and will continue to do so as it builds out projects for our clients, building out the global cannabis supply chain. What does GPS do? What GPS does is it performs project management or outsourcing services. Companies come to us with a budget, and we select their genetics, we teach their farmers how to cultivate, we build out their extraction facilities, we build their business development teams, their sales teams, and their executive leadership. And then GPS remains on board to help commerce internationally between its projects all around the world. Now, why do I say those things? I just want to let you all know that nothing that's happening here in Colombia or anywhere else around the world is new. It's only new in the particular jurisdiction it's happening. It's only new to you. I've worked here in Colombia for the last 4+ years. I've been to Colombia 16 times in those 4 years, and it's one of my favorite places to be. And I applaud your political leadership for recently changing the law to allow for the exportation of flower. Do you know how big how important that is for participating in the global cannabis economy? Look at other countries in the Western Hemisphere. Look at other countries in the region. Look at what Mexico is about to do. Colombia has an advantage right now because for the last number of years, it has provided licensing, it has created a stable cultivation framework, and it has begun to build out world-class extraction and processing facilities. Now, when a new country like Mexico or ultimately Brazil or Argentina comes online, the same thing will happen. How does Colombia participate in that supply chain? Well, it already has a supply chain intact. And now with the allowance for the exportation of flower, it can become a meaningful player in global commerce. The top 2 countries in the Western Hemisphere that export cannabis flower are Canada and Uruguay. Uruguay is a very small country, as many of you know. Canada's cost of production, cost of compliance with regulations is very high. So it makes a place like Colombia situated very, very well for participation in global commerce. So I'm excited to be here for that reason, and you all should be excited too. But that's not what I'm here to talk about for the next several minutes. And I also want to invite some questions at the end, or please let your questions save them for after. Let's talk about the history of cannabis investing. Let's talk about the history of cannabis investing and how it got us here to where we are today. What are the trends? Now, for those of you that don't know, I write a regular column for Forbes magazine in the United States. You can Google my name, Robert Hoban, H-O-B-A-N, Forbes, and you can view my columns. The slides that I did prepare, but unfortunately did not make it to the right people, had some of those links on there, and we'll circulate those after the fact. But recently I wrote about several topics which are very, very important for purposes of investing. So let's talk a little bit about the history of cannabis investing. And it's a big topic. But when you look at it from afar, you can break it down. What's important about breaking down the trends in cannabis investing? Because the patterns repeat themselves over and over and over again. The investment patterns repeat themselves. The challenges, country by country, repeat themselves. We've seen it here in Colombia, where the regulatory agencies have modified their rules, the regulations, not once, not twice, multiple times. That is very, very important, that the regulations and the regulatory agencies can change. Before the Canadians legalized cannabis, Prime Minister Trudeau announced that he was seeking to legalize cannabis. Just saying that, before the legislature in Canada acted, changed the face of cannabis investing. We'll get to that. But what was cannabis investing like before Canada? BC. What was cannabis investing like before Canada? Cannabis investments were primarily US based. There wasn't a global cannabis economy to speak of at the time. Cannabis investments were largely individuals that came from other wealthy or risky industries, like the adult entertainment industry, the tobacco industry, the spirits industry. Those types of individuals got into a high-risk business in the United States, which to this very day, and you know this well, there is no interstate commerce surrounding cannabis in the United States. It's still federally legal. At least marijuana is federally illegal. Hemp, cáñamo, is not federally illegal. The difference in the United States is the THC content, right? 0.3% tetrahydrocannabinol, the psychoactive compound in the plant. That's the only legal difference. Those of you that cultivate, those of you that produce genetics, you understand that the plant is far more capable of being defined by things other than THC. But that's the legal definition. And of course, we've seen the 1% countries. We've seen the 0.2% countries ultimately adopt to the US standard. And we're seeing other countries look at 1.5% THC as that line in the sand. But before Canada, people would invest in individual states. And what happened in the United States was an interesting experiment, because most states came out with dispensaries and cultivation before there was state regulation. What do I mean by that? Take a state like my state of Colorado. Colorado passed a constitutional provision almost 15 years ago now. That constitutional provision allowed for caregivers to provide, manufacture, and distribute cannabis to qualified medical marijuana patients. That was not a state law. It was not intended necessarily to be a commercial program, a for-profit program. It was intended to create an exception to criminal law so that people could cultivate and possess marijuana for very specific medical conditions. So how did you invest in that? People did. They invest millions and millions upon tens of millions of dollars. And I've never seen an industry, and I've been an M&A attorney for a very long time now, over 20 years. In doing so, I've never seen people invest tens of millions of dollars with so little due diligence, without very much attention to what they were investing in. Can you imagine investing in a business which there's no guarantee if it's going to be there tomorrow? Those were the early days of cannabis. That still happens in many jurisdictions around the world before there are regulations. I met investors in New York They said, Bob, we invested in the cannabis industry. I said, tell me what? Medical cannabis, they say. I said, what's medical cannabis? What's your investment? We invested in 3 dispensaries, retail outlets in California that distribute medical marijuana. I said, so what's medical? What's medicinal about that investment? If someone told you they invested in medical marijuana, to me, that means that they're participating in some form of a supply chain that supplies API, active pharmaceutical ingredient materials, to pharmaceutical companies or to researchers. That's not what they invested in. But they didn't know any better. There were no regulations. There was no uniformity. There was no guarantee that those businesses would be there the next day, yet they continued to invest tens upon tens of millions of dollars across the United States, and a lot of that money was lost. Why? Because the early movers in the cannabis industry in North America were folks that had come from underground, right? These were folks that participated in a traditional or an illicit market that moved over to a commercial marketplace. That didn't mean that they were the best business people. That didn't mean that they could scale cultivation from a small facility to a very large facility. So many of these businesses failed. But again, the investment was on the small side, not in terms of dollars, in terms of sophistication. Then came Canada. So Trudeau says it's my objective to legalize cannabis within Canada. What happened? The Toronto Exchange, the Canadian Securities Exchange became available. And this is nothing new for those exchanges, by the way. Those Canadian exchanges have typically bet on new and emerging markets, typically minerals, fuels, and the like. This was no different, but it was the first country in North America. The first North American country, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, to legalize cannabis. And the dollars began to amass in the banks. It began to build up until the exchanges were able to take it upon legalization. Then what happened? What happened next? There was the rise of the Canadian licensee, invested to the tunes of billions upon billions of dollars, because these were publicly traded companies, by and large, not all of them, but it was easy to go to a capital market, a public capital market in Canada, and raise hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Now, that's not the way most business goes. Most of the time in business, you create and establish a company. You build the reputation of that company. You take it public many steps down the road. But that didn't allow for commercial activity. That didn't allow for commercial activity in cannabis. So the dollars came in, the dollars were spent. What did the Canadian companies do? They didn't have dispensaries. They didn't have cultivation facilities like we had in the United States, which, by the way, those facilities were not perfect, far from it, but at least there was experience there. So the Canadian companies began to hire consultants from some of the leading consulting firms in the world. Deloitte Canada. My good friend Frank Vitis, the former CEO of Deloitte Canada, he took a bet. He says, we are going to actively promote and lead the commercial cannabis industry in Canada. So those companies began to hire highly educated professionals from places like Deloitte Canada and other spin-off consulting firms within Canada. Those folks had MBA degrees. They were well educated in business and finance. They understood agriculture, but they didn't understand cannabis. So what happened? Those companies failed, most of them. Many of them still exist, and they're going to grow larger and larger if they can sustain what's to come. The rise was also because of the fact that the money had to be spent under this theory. If I'm a large operator, take, for example, Canopy Growth. The theory was that there's only so many companies in this industry, so many assets right now in this industry on a global scale. Let's compete with one another to acquire as much of the existing operators and operations and assets as possible. It didn't matter whether they were good or bad. It didn't matter whether they were profitable or not. What mattered was that they were, in theory, purely in theory, buying up market share. That also caused valuations from new emerging market valuation techniques to put enormous values on companies. I had a Polish client, one of the first clients that I had acquired or invested by a Canadian company. It had $500,000 in sales. It sold for $12 million. How does that math work? It doesn't work. That company's out of business. That investment is gone. But this is the ups and the downs of the cannabis industry. So then what happened? We had MSOs, multi-state operators in the United States. It was happening around the same time, but right around April of 2019, we saw major fractures in the Canadian finance market towards cannabis. Tremendous fractures. By August, it was almost all over. Those dollars began to be funneled in a variety of ways because of cross-listing public companies in the northeastern exchanges in the US, and other access to public capital coming in from places all over the world, bringing that in to the United States so that people could buy these dispensaries, these cultivation facilities, state by state by state, aggregating them. What's the theory there? Most of these companies in the United States, while they generate gross revenues that are very large, their net revenue, their profits, are very small. Thank you. Thank you. Why is that? It's because of something in the United States called 280E. It's a tax provision. I won't go into the legal aspects of it. But it doesn't allow cannabis businesses to take normal business deductions. Let's just leave it at that. If I have a business and I generate $100 in revenue and my expenses are $100, I probably pay zero taxes because it nets out to zero. In the cannabis industry, those deductions are not nearly as friendly as regular businesses. So the bet for the multi-state operator acquisition was this. It was that the US government was going to legalize cannabis, or as we say in the United States, end prohibition. Still hasn't happened, and we at least in theory have a favorable government in place in the United States. Although, of course, there's many other challenges going on in the United States politically right now, so it's not at the top of their list. But if that bet doesn't occur, if that theory doesn't happen anytime soon, can those companies sustain? The answer is probably no. Because you can aggregate operations, but if you can't create interstate commerce, in other words, make it more efficient, do you know that in the United States, every single state has to create its own supply chain? You know how inefficient that is? Think about if you had a cultivation and a processing facility right in the middle of the United States. Call it St. Louis, Missouri. And then you could distribute that product all around the United States. That can't happen. Instead, you have to build an ecosystem, state by state by state. That's very bad for economics, but it's very good for policy movement. We don't have great policy leadership from our politicians in the United States on this issue. Politicians don't lead. They get out of the way. Most of the US laws were passed by citizen initiatives, meaning citizens signed a piece of paper, they got 60 or 70,000 signatures per state or more, and the citizens voted whether they wanted to legalize marijuana or not. The politicians then get that if it passes, and they say, we don't want to touch this. So the leadership has been very, very poor. But why is that important? It's important because you have inefficient aggregation of assets in these multi-state operators. At the same time, the MSOs were aggregating and are aggregating. You have some of the larger ones, Acreage and Harvest, GTI, Trulieve. The CBD industry became a thing. Has anyone ever heard of CBD before? CBD is something that the whole world is talking about. And I'm very proud to say that I sued the DEA in 2016 and obtained a favorable ruling which cracked that industry open in 2016. There was no industry before that, but there was a farm bill that opened the door for hemp production. When they legalized hemp production, they didn't know, the policymakers didn't know what CBD was or any of the other non-intoxicating cannabinoids that are medicinally beneficial. So the CBD industry comes around. Companies went, after the case that we prevailed on in 2016, companies that we represented went from 500,000 in sales to 5 million in sales in 30 days. Those companies went on to gross 50, 60, 80, $100 million. Perhaps one of the most well-known brands out there is Charlotte's Web, a publicly traded company now, which isn't the most efficiently run, but it is one of the first and largest in terms of market cap and revenue. We've worked with Charlotte's Web for a very long time. We know their ups and downs, but that didn't come easy. And then what happened? Continued investment in CBD. Do you know that 3 years ago in the United States, we had 500,000 acres registered, not grown, but registered for hemp production in the United States? We only grew about half of that, and about 90% of what was grown was left in the field because there was nowhere to sell it. Why? Because there are no regulations right now. So the theory on CBD is this is an ingredient that doesn't get people high, that has a medicinal benefit, and it's legal. It will be in everything. It will be in candy bars. It will be in dog food. It will be in baby formula. It will be in everything you eat, drink, touch, and brush your teeth with. Of course, that hasn't happened yet because our FDA has not yet issued final rules. So it's still a gray area. But the gray area is good too if you're an investor. Why? Because if my product is in a stable environment, who are my competitors? Procter & Gamble, Kraft, Coca-Cola. Not the types of companies like Charlotte's Web, and there's nothing wrong with Charlotte's Web, great company, but it's not Procter & Gamble, if you follow me. When the regulation comes down, those investments might be for nothing because those larger companies already have processing, resources, and facilities and very inexpensive US-based cannabis production, hemp production. So that was the trend, continued to be the trend. Many people lost on those MSO investments and the CBD investments, although they're coming back slowly. Now, last year, what did we see? The introduction of the SPAC. Who's heard of SPACs? It's an entity that's created to go out and raise money and acquire assets, primarily distressed assets. But most of these SPACs don't have operational plans behind the acquisition. So they buy assets. It's the exact same thing that happened in Canada, guys, but with very little opportunity to create operational efficiencies around the businesses that they acquire or invest in. So from an investment perspective, it also went flat. But the good news is behind that is the bet. What's the bet? That cannabis will be, prohibition will have ended in the United States. Still hasn't happened. Now, what have we seen at the tail end of the SPAC investment? We've seen infrastructure surrounding hemp. What do I mean by that? I mean harvest technology, curing technology, technology that separates the fiber from the herd, pulping the herd to remove the cellulose, the lignin, the sugar, the building blocks for plastics and fuels. Is anyone in this room interested in participating in industrial hemp, or are cannabinoids far more interesting? I see people raising their hand, and I think that's important because there is money to be made in industrial hemp infrastructure globally, but it's not the exciting thing that THC or cannabinoids is. But it's rooted in agriculture. It's rooted in industry and commerce. Think about the fact that most automobile manufacturers in the world have industrial hemp built into their door paneling plans. There's not a reliable, consistent supply source yet, but they'll use that industrial hemp. Why? Because it reduces the noise in the passenger compartment, unlike other synthetic compounds or natural compounds. So there's a bet to be made there. That's one simple use, let alone plastics or fuels. We know that hemp can be used for those things, but it takes time. Plus, farmers need to understand that they're not going to get rich growing a single-purpose crop. What do I mean by a single-purpose crop? A feminized hemp plant that has a high level of CBD that can't be used for anything else has very little value. It doesn't have a high value because the market becomes saturated very, very quickly. So the hemp infrastructure is something that we see a lot of development around, and I would encourage you to take a close look at that. I'm going to hit some of these trends, and then I'm going to buzz through some of these slides here, if they're still available. And that is this. Investment now, the trends that I see. Back to where I talked about from 12 years ago, medical marijuana, what does that mean? It means API grade, active pharmaceutical ingredient grade materials. Cannabinoids that are isolated or formulated such that they can be used for research purposes, medicinal purposes at a pharmaceutical level all around the world. If you're producing a facility and you're not trying to achieve API status, not just GMP, that's yesterday's news. If you're not trying to achieve API status, you will likely be left out of the game. Look at a place like Brazil, where you can register non-intoxicating cannabinoids and begin to insert them into their Anvisa healthcare program. But only if it has that high level of certification, and that's not inexpensive. That's one trend. Another trend, which has always been there, but it's more prevalent than ever, intellectual property. Intellectual property, patents, formulas, plant genetic protection, whereby you look at something that people use for other things, but you have an investor that was smart enough to get a patent to use hemp, cannabis, or some compound from the plant in making that thing perform better. That is what I would look very, very closely at. And if you're producing an oil, whether it's GMP for consumers or API for pharmaceutical grade ingredients, just make sure that what you're doing contains technology, bioavailability, water solubility. These are basic things now. They weren't even talked about 6 and 7 years ago. What's next? That's the technology you should be looking for. And of course, the adult use market is a place that we see a lot of activity. Once again, on what I call the bet that the U.S. will legalize cannabis. And let me comment on that for 1 minute. We had our vice president co-sponsor something called the MORE Act. It passed the House of Representatives, did not pass the Senate. That would do two things. It would create social and criminal justice reform in the United States, and it would remove marijuana, the plant, from the Controlled Substances Act. It's a big deal, but it doesn't create commercialization. Now, there was a recent bill which grew off of that, called the Schumer Bill, is what we call it, and it added a commercial element to it. Now, guess what's happening in the United States? The marijuana companies are fighting with each other whether they want interstate commerce or not, because they've built those supply chains state by state by state, and maybe it doesn't make sense to have interstate commerce right now because it eliminates their advantage, and they've had so much investment. I don't talk about these things that happened in the United States because we do it right. We don't. We do it by mistake. We learn from our mistakes over and over and over again. But I think there's an opportunity for folks, particularly in this region of the world, to look at the mistakes that we've made and try to avoid those mistakes. I've worked with your government. I've worked with 35 governments around the world to help them get from here to here without making mistakes. They always make mistakes anyway, but that's not because they're not trying. And look for those patterns. Now, I am going to, if I could, just go to that slide and sort of round some of these things out. The last thing I'll note is the adult use market. Look at a place like Mexico. Recreational cannabis is going to be something that is very, very big. we'll see that as domestic distribution gets approved in multiple jurisdictions. Remember, most countries, particularly Colombia, we look at export only. That is not a sustainable model from a public policy and a commercial standpoint. You need to have domestic distribution, but there are cultural challenges, there are educational challenges around this plant, which was seen as a narcotic and a blight on society for so long. So, try to move this thing forward. So I talked a little bit about gateway proven strategies. Take a look at my monthly Forbes columns. If you can't sleep at night, I've done over 150 podcasts called the Hoban Minute. We interview the top people in the cannabis industry over the last 2 years. They're 20 minutes long. It's very easy. And I've been told my voice is very soothing and puts people to sleep. So please take a listen to that. Look at some of the numbers, though. From 2019, Prohibition Partners said 853% growth, $73 billion by 2027 on a global market. What is it going to be that's going to make this market come to fruition? If you're a THC producer, even if it is API grade today, who's your buyer? You can't tell me who your buyer is because there's less than this many THC buyers in the entire world. That's an exaggeration to illustrate a point. But it's not a viable market right now for THC. For flower export, yes. For THC oil, no. Not without API grade certification and not without connections to that industry. So look at the non-intoxicating cannabinoids. Look at CBD. Look at terpenes. Do you know that terpenes from cannabis are the highest price point per milligram from the plant? Period. Look at that. Wall Street's got a close eye on this. But what does that mean? Where does it go? If the United States passes what's called the Safe Banking Act, which I predict will happen next summer, you will see the dollars that I talked about 20 minutes ago that came out of Canada look very, very tiny. When the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange are allowed to participate in a public markets enterprise, the game is over, meaning legalization is here to stay, and the dollars that came in will make that $12 million Polish acquisition for a $500,000 generating company look small. That company will probably be sold for $26 million the next time around. That's the way of the public markets. Be there for that, but build something that is there to stay. Don't just build a business that's going to cash out and go public. 99 out of 100 of those companies or more will fail. It's not worth the bet. The bet needs to be a mix of risk-taking and building a viable piece of a supply chain, and you can't do it yourself. We saw the Canadian companies, Canopy Growth, a good company. I don't malign them. But they had billions of dollars to spend, and they spent almost all of it, and they have no supply chain to show for it. You can't be your own supply chain unless it's on a very, very small scale. Now, just a little bit of the history of cannabis, and I think this is interesting because it kind of tells you how we got today. You guys know the history of uses that were introduced in China in the 20th century. We had English settlers in the United States in the 1600s grow cannabis. In the 18th and 19th century, not only did people grow cannabis, hemp primarily, low THC cannabis, but you could pay your taxes in the United States with industrial hemp for a period of time. And then they began to discover in the 1830s in the United States that cannabis was some form of medicine, not to the level of our great Dr. Meshulam out of Israel and what they've done recently, but they began to realize that this plant didn't just make you feel good, it healed your body. Then, of course, California, perhaps the most flexible state in the United States regarding cannabis laws, was the first to ban cannabis. Isn't that strange? It just goes to show that in politics in the United States, we always talk out of both sides of our mouth. In 1930, the DEA was established. Do you know that in 1935, the second largest cash crop in the United States was industrial hemp? By 1937, you could no longer cultivate industrial hemp in the United States because they were fearful of the intoxicating compound THC. They called the plant marijuana with an H. Who spells marijuana with an H? That's in our Controlled Substances Act. And it really got rid of something very, very special. And at that same time in the 30s, there was a major magazine in the United States that said, this is the next billion-dollar crop. They were talking about cannabis in the 1930s as a billion-dollar crop. But that Marijuana Tax Act passed in 1937, and that history set everything backward. You had the Controlled Substances Act in 1971, which was a reaction to the United Nations treaties. And then, of course, here we are with 1996, California once again legalizing medicinal cannabis, and then some states legalized recreational marijuana, Colorado and Washington being the first two. And now we have activity in Congress, as you see. So this is one of the articles I wrote, and it talks about navigating the wave. Wall Street analysts are hot on this industry, but they try to treat it as if it's any emerging industry, and it is not. It evolves differently. That's why so many of these companies have failed. So please, consult with people that have a long history in the space. We looked at 2021 as the year of consolidation. We saw early in the year GW Pharmaceutical, or Greenwich Biosciences, their North American affiliate, was acquired by Jazz Pharmaceutical in an enormous financial deal. Within days of that, we saw another merger of multi-state operators being acquired. That trend has continued to this day. In fact, one of the reasons I sold my law firm is because I saw the writing on the wall. Consolidation is not an if, it's a when. You need to understand when it's your turn to look for partners. Pick your lane, don't try to do it all. I did, and it's the best thing that's ever happened, but more importantly, this is what these companies are doing right now. They realize they can't do it all. Let's look at the year in review of 2020, because I think this is telling from an investment trend perspective. Now, 2019 wasn't a great year for cannabis stocks. Cannabis stocks were down in 2019. What happened? We also had the vape crisis in 2019. In fact, I was in Jamaica at Montego Bay when the vape crisis went down. The vape crisis meaning there were compounds contained in many marijuana vape products that were getting people very, very sick. This caused a reaction from state governments, and it also caused us to look closely at what is it that these companies are selling and how do those products, not the compounds from the cannabis plant, but the other chemicals and compounds, how do they interact with the human body? 2020 started flat. Then what happened? The coronavirus flattened everything out even more, but that didn't stop the cannabis industry from moving forward. Think about that. We're in a global pandemic currently, and we were certainly at that time in a major way. Yet, the cannabis industry kept making progress. It was deemed an essential business. It was allowed to stay open when other businesses were closed in numerous places around the world. We saw the state of Illinois enact adult use cannabis. Why is that important? Why is that a trend that matters? Because Chicago is an enormous city with an enormous population of cannabis users. Now we have Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York on the map with legalized cannabis. Those markets will dictate how consumer products are developed, and I'm so anxious to see how our neighbors to the south in Mexico unroll their adult use recreational program. The World Economic Forum, where I was speaking about cannabis in February of 2020, right before the pandemic, cannabis was on the agenda as a sustainable crop, as a way to create plant-based economies. There was policy movement even though we were going into a pandemic. The European Union Court of Justice rendered a decision that industrial hemp derivatives that are legal in one member state are also legal in other member states, and that they should not be treated as narcotics. There's more to that ruling, but that's the gist of it. Why does that matter to you? That matters because the consumer activity in Europe right now is what we saw from 2015 to 2018 and 19 in the United States, and the price points are very, very high. Then what happened at the end of the year? Numerous other states in the United States legalized cannabis. New York, Virginia announced plans, big states. But the United Nations did something that goes back to 1971 with our Controlled Substances Act. Our Controlled Substances Act, which became a model, quote unquote, even though it's not very good legislation, it became a model for the rest of the world. And you know the challenges firsthand that brought to our friends and neighbors to the south, all across Latin America. The terrible drug war. That's the Controlled Substances Act. Well, the United Nations is reclassifying cannabis. It will ultimately require through its work groups that the member nations, the signatory countries to those treaties, change their laws, change their Controlled Substances Acts to revise their approach to marijuana and to make medical exceptions and to go so far as to look at non-intoxicating compounds from the hemp plant as no longer being under the UN control. We're not there yet, but that's significant movement in 1 year. And that was a year where most of us had very limited activity because of the pandemic and lockdowns, et cetera. So the cannabis industry is here to stay, but you have to look at the trends. I know how hard it is to stay in the trenches and to build these businesses. I've served as a CEO for 2 multi-state operators and for the largest botanical extractor in the world in 2019 and the early 2020 when I built out their cannabinoid division. I know how challenging that is. But if you can't step back, recognize the patterns and the trends, you're going to miss your opportunity. And all it takes to go from someone who makes $180 million in investment to someone who makes $180 in investment is a few months in this space. So stay tuned and look for that Safe Banking Act, because the Safe Banking Act will cause major players to not only line up their capital like we saw in Canada, but in the United States. But you know what else it will do? It will cause those players to not just sit back and say, well, when cannabis is legal, we'll participate in it. All of a sudden, they're activists. They're lobbying actively for that change. Look at what Amazon did only a few months ago. Amazon said, not only should cannabis be legal, why? Because they want to deliver cannabis, but we're going to lobby for it. When the leaders in Washington, D.C. hear that legalization cry from large companies like that, it will change the direction in this industry and its resilience. It's another article that I talked about how 2019 and 2020 during the pandemic really saw cannabis take its place, not only as a viable therapeutic and a replacement for other products, but as a good corporate citizen, where the principles about environmental and social governance and being a good corporate citizen and neighbor came into play. That means that this industry is here to stay, despite the fact that there are people that would like to see it go away. So when you want to make a profit off cannabis, you've got to look at a few things. Look at whether you're in a medical realm or a consumer product realm. Just because the program says medical cannabis does not mean you have anything to do with medicine. That just means that's the qualification of your purchaser. In an adult use regime, your purchaser is an adult. That's all they have to be, is an adult with an identification, and they can purchase cannabis. And a medical marijuana program in the United States, medical doesn't mean medical. It just means that you must have one of the qualified conditions to purchase cannabis. Real medicine is what's happening in Europe. Real medicine is the API grade supply chain that I'm talking about. Categories that have really promising growth: edibles and drinks. Drinks especially. We represent one of the largest spirit producers in the world. They came in and they are going very, very deep into establishing infused cannabis beverages. But here's the challenge with cannabis beverages. When you consume one, let's say you consume one beer. Generally, someone doesn't drink one beer. If you consume one cannabis beverage, you go from 0 to high very quickly. That doesn't necessarily produce that repeatable effect where you can have a sessionable experience. Those things are being figured out right now, and it's not as simple as saying, well, put 2 milligrams in it versus 10. It's far more complex than that. But look at beer companies and spirit companies doing that. The edibles marketplace. I know that it's not legal to produce edible products in most markets right now, but that is the wave of the future. People don't like to consume smoke, even if it is a vape product, increasingly so with our younger population, and the health studies would seem to support that notion. But at the end of the day, it's those edibles that is something that you should look at. For example, there are some great companies in Mexico that we're working with that are producing wonderful chocolates, salsas, a number of other edible products. Cannabinoids can and should be available in most food products, but stay tuned for our FDA, because when our FDA creates those rules on non-intoxicating hemp-derived cannabinoids, those rules are going to spread all over the globe. They're not going to be good ones, but that's just the way it has tended to work. So stay tuned, maybe even be involved in that process. Look at Constellation, one of the first major companies besides Scott's Miracle-Gro to invest in the cannabis space. It put billions of dollars into canopy. Constellation, of course, is the producer of Corona and another of other alcoholic beverage products. It was a consumer bet. It was a bet, much like tobacco companies that began to get into the vape industry. They saw what was coming next. And I don't know if you read the study. It was in one of the New York newspapers the other day. It indicated that consumers of cannabis was up. New Frontier Data came up with those numbers. Consumer numbers are up, way up in 2020 of cannabis products. But at the same time, the product distribution is somewhat narrow. That's an inconsistency that can't necessarily be sustained. But that is the consumer bet, that consumers will continue to use these products and that it will replace traditional vice-type products. The person who drinks a glass of wine every night is starting to turn to cannabis. Certainly young people are, in major, major ways. So consumer behavior and trends indicate that. Check out that report from New Frontier Data. Then, of course, the medical bet, initially from GW Pharmaceuticals. But as I point out, I've worked with companies all over the world, major pharmaceutical companies that are already deep into studying this and have been for years. And guess what they're looking for? Reliable, consistent pharmaceutical ingredient supply chain. That is the holy grail. That is the future if you want to be sustainable and create a business. Now, there's nothing wrong with participating in the industry and creating craft products, creating high-quality products that make you proud and that can be regionally distributed that aren't API grade. But if the opportunity is enormous and you want to go big, going big sounds like API to me. Now, of course, there's the U.S. Marijuana Index. This is an index of stocks. Most of the stocks are traded on Canadian exchanges. You can't necessarily go onto your web platform and buy Canadian stocks with ease, although there's a number of ways to do it. Look at the Canadian markets. Look at this marijuana index. You'll see what's happening. When Jazz acquired GW, the stock investment for those that were early movers was quite substantial. Look for things like that. If you're in the industry, you see them coming before anybody else does. You hear them coming before anybody else does. And that's not insider trading. Volatility in the marketplace does create opportunity. And it's that opportunity that I would encourage you to keep taking a look at, because the more uncertainty, the more the products are worth, the more the business is worth now. But that's not the sustainable bet. The sustainable bet is long-time production and commerce. We've talked about these global markets, and I'll just touch on them here in the last few minutes. The Canadian market came out very, very strong. We've seen the Israeli market. You know, the Israeli stock exchange, they changed the rules so that something that wasn't legal in Israel could be invested and be funded by the public markets within Israel. Didn't really go that far, and of course Israel has come around to changing their laws for domestic distribution. But it's an example of what we're seeing in many markets around the world. We're seeing that in the London exchange, the Frankfurt exchange. What do these mean to you? It means that you need to pay attention to who's putting out press releases for cross-listing, going public, reporting, because those are your buyers. I imagine those of you in the industry today are here to find one main thing. Who's going to buy your product and where are they located? You need to connect the dots on a global map. We have a map in our office, and it's every transaction that we've worked on. There's a string from this country to this country all over the world. So we know what those supply chain routes look like. We know where those deals have been done. You can read about them. It's not a secret, but understand what's happening in real time, who the real buyers are. SPACs continue to exist, and they continue to look for investment outside of the United States and across the United States. So pay attention to that. That is about all I had to cover here today. I wanted to reserve a time. If anyone had a few questions at the very end, I'm happy to field them. Otherwise, I'd be happy to talk with anybody on the side. But I do appreciate your time. And does anyone have a question? I'll repeat the question so everybody can hear it. Yes, sir. In the blue shirt.
Thank you for the time. I wanted to ask you, here in Colombia, as a matter of fact, we don't have a regulation to have an API facility, especially related to cannabis. So thinking as the representative of the MOH this morning said, we will have it, assuming that that will happen soon, 2 or 3 years. What do you think is the best bet for a Colombian company to produce APIs able to and be able to export them to the United States or Europe? That are the main markets for that kind of products right now.
That's a great question. So in the absence of API certification that's government sanctioned or government approved, currently you don't require API certification to engage in international commerce. Most of the products are not produced at that level. I'm looking at what's next. I always look at what's next. That's why my clients are always successful, because we know what's happening next. What's next is API. What's now is still GMP for that purpose. So when the government comes around, that doesn't mean you as a company can't put API grade standards in place, hire an API grade consultant so that your facility operates at that level. Because remember, these companies are not producing mass commercial quantities for millions and millions and millions of people from a pharmaceutical perspective yet. They're simply looking at what the market has to offer and doing research. So less than API certification will do for now, but it will not do in the future when these are commoditized ingredients that are being traded, particularly the THC component. Because I've seen so much excitement in Colombia around THC, but there's not that many buyers for THC in the entire world right now. When there will be, they're going to buy API. You can't just keep shipping GMP THC to Germany over and over and over again, because they're going to cultivate their own and produce their own. Switzerland is well on its way to becoming a major producer and major player in that region. So API is what's required at the next step. I hope that helps. Anyone? I would note that, unless anybody has any questions, I would note that I just want to paint a real picture. What you're doing is very challenging, what everyone's doing, and I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to see so many friends and people coming together in person for the first time in a very long time. But at the end of the day, this is business, and this is big business. And with big business comes big cannabis, big marijuana. Big marijuana is not to be feared. Big cannabis is not to be something to be afraid of. These are your partners. These are the people that need the research, the technology, the formulas, the data, the experience, the genetics that people in this room and companies in this room possess. companies that come into a space and try to do it themselves from scratch mostly fail. We saw that in Canada on a big stage. But here, we're looking at a scenario where you have an opportunity to participate with the major players. If you have, listen to these things from an investment perspective, a good leadership and management team. Number one, corporate structure, leadership, and management. They don't care how good the cannabis is. They don't care about your sales if you don't have square one. Good organization and good leadership. What is good leadership in this space? It's not someone that just has cannabis industry experience, although that's important. You need someone that has a variety of experiences. Pharmaceutical experience, consumer packaged goods, CPG experience, experience in the spirits or the liquor industry, experience in distribution on a global scale. Those are the talents and the skill sets that you should be looking for. Then, once your company is structured well and you've got the right leadership in place, don't waste your time not paying attention to your business, talking to every single investor you could find. Find someone to help you do that. There are investment bankers in this space. There are consulting companies like Gateway Proven Strategies, GPS, in this space that can help you. You can't do it alone. And in the year of consolidation, which this is, I don't believe that you should continue to try doing it on your own, because your success might be happy to you, but there's so much more to be achieved. Thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for the opportunity from the Expo. Have a wonderful afternoon and wonderful evening.